Hi friends, I hope you're doing well. If you're new to this channel, welcome. And if you're not, welcome back. Today I want to give some time to planning your painting. Not everyone may be comfortable with diving headfirst into a spontaneous landscape painting. Some may need to go step by step and really figure out how to put their masterpiece together. Now there's many ways of going about this, from thumbnails and mood boards to small studies. Small studies is what we're going to primarily talk about today. So I came across an old video and I decided to use it to plan my next painting. So forgive the video quality, it's old. But before we get started, go ahead and like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. But most importantly, share it with someone who you think might benefit from these fundamentals. I hope to hear from you, so go ahead and leave a comment below. I'm Kendall Stump, and welcome to the Stump Project. Okay, so let's jump right in here. So like I mentioned earlier, this video is going to be a little bit different. This is, it's a watercolor painting, but it's more of a study. It's a sketch or a plan for a bigger painting, which I'm going to do in an upcoming video. So I thought that I would take this older video that I have and repurpose it to kind of demonstrate the points of watercolor and gouache and the usefulness of developing a plan for a bigger painting. So what we want to do here is I'm planning out for a bigger for a snow scene. So you start off a watercolor painting. Well, I'm starting this off by taping off my canvas or my paper. I apologize for the lighting in this video. It's really hard to see the contrast between the background trees, the lighter colored trees, the paper, and then the midground trees. But you're building on layers when you're doing this. So light to dark, again, light to dark. So you should see suggestions of trees in the background and paint right over them. Paint right over them. It's okay. You go out and you just look out your window and there are things behind other things. So, and the things that are behind those other things still exist. So it's okay. Paint over trees, paint over your shrubs, paint over your buildings, whatever you have. I'm using 300-pound GSM paper in a watercolor notebook. Just something small, just enough for me to convey my idea. So one of the first things that I do is I like to wet the canvas. And that allows me to put paint in specific areas because the paint will bleed in the wet. So where I have not dampened the canvas, the paint won't go. And then I also use you can use a hair dryer. I use a heat gun to help dry the paint quickly in between layers. Now, there is a conversation to be had between letting the paint dry naturally and using an accelerant to help speed up the drying. It can have a little bit of a different effect. So you may want to play with that to kind of see if you can capture what you were trying to capture. Now, working in watercolor and gouache is a little bit differently than working in oils. You almost work backwards. So in oils, you'll work from dark to light. In watercolors, you work from light to dark. And the reason for that is you can't, there is no white watercolor paint. Now there's white gouache, which is a little bit different than watercolor. But white watercolor is essentially water. You're not going to be able to add any pigment to your colors that you have down there sufficiently enough to light it. Now there is white watercolor, don't get me wrong. There's like, I think it's zinc, different things like that, and it's mainly for mixing. It's not for using as an overlay or anything to lighten your stuff that you already have on canvas. So, but you use you go from light to dark. The light is the paper. That's your painting isn't going to get any more brighter than what your paper is. So you try to keep that paper as clean and pure as possible in the areas that you want white. And you can use masking fluid, you can use tape, you can use frets, whatever that you need to use in order to maintain the purity of that paper in those areas. And then you just gradually work darker. Again, another reason is because watercolor is so transparent. So everything that you put down, it builds on itself. And it will continue to build on itself, and you'll continue to see through it. So if you start dark and you try to go light, well, that dark is always going to show through. Very, very challenging if you try to go with that route. Now, I mentioned gouache earlier. Gouache is a more opaque version of watercolor, and what I mean by that is gouache is. It's still activated by water. You still apply it the same way as you would watercolor, except it's opaque. Traditional watercolor is not. It is very transparent. And so I will tend to use gouache as highlights sparingly. You can even use, if you don't need it to activate again, you can even go in and use either white acrylic or white gesso. Those work as well. But what I'm doing here is I'm starting with my background and trying to put that in. I'm putting in trees. I put saw at the very beginning, I put a very light color down. This is primarily grayscale. It's a winter scene, winter forest scene, so there's not going to be much color involved. Although working in values, like we've spoken before, you can use whatever colors you like, as long as your value is correct. You whatever. I mean, this could be a beautiful sunset scene or a sunrise scene if you wanted it to be. Get your values correct, and it doesn't matter. So I put a very light color down for the sky. So remember, working light to dark. And now I'm going through and doing the farthest back trees. So you can see that the paint that's going down there is just a hint of paint. It's light suggestions of paint and foliage and shapes, and I'm not drawing every leaf. I'm just putting value down on the paper, just to kind of start to convey that idea of what may be back there. Just suggestions. Another advantage of doing a sketch and going light like this, you can change things up. If things aren't going exactly the way that you want them to go, change them up. And this is the time to change them in your sketch, in your planning phase, because once you get to the oils, you generally have some kind of an idea in mind. Now, I say that, but I think you guys know I like to do spontaneous paintings, meaning I just go at it and then whatever happens, happens. Some people have suggested that they don't necessarily like to work spontaneously. They like a little bit more structure. They like to have things a little bit more planned out. This is how you do that. Take a little time, gather some resources, some inspirations, wherever those may be, and gather those up and start your sketch phase. Now, you may even start this one step earlier. You may start this with what's called thumbnails, and those may be like maybe 1 inch by 2 inch, I'm sorry, other way around, 2 inch by 1 inch illustrations that you just sketch out with a pencil to kind of get the idea. Again, you're not using any kind of detail whatsoever in these kinds of things, just to get an idea of placement of these things. And then once you got something that you think can work compositionally, and maybe that's another video we talk about composition and how things should be laid out on your canvas. Once you get things laid out compositionally, then you can go in to your sketchbook like I am here and start to lay out what you think might be the next step. and explore a little bit of your idea. Some people will do 2 or 3 or 4 versions of this step right here, this watercolor painting. Maybe you'll explore color. Maybe you'll explore value a little bit more. Maybe you want to know, what does it look like if the sun was on the horizon versus straight overhead? Well, the lighting is going to be different, so maybe you'll explore that a little bit. And here's another example. I'm putting in some of the fine branches of the trees. I smashed my brush down on the bristles to make them splay or spread out. And then I used that to just go in and kind of dry brush and just pull out some fine lines just by using texture of the brush. Some of that can be done in the thumbnail step, but not to great detail. It's just a thumbnail. It's just a vague idea of shapes and value. It's when you get to this step, you'll spend a little bit more time kind of planning out and doing studies of how you may want to approach this. I wouldn't take a whole lot of time putting something like this together. However long it takes you, but I mean, I wouldn't spend hours and hours. You're not trying to paint a masterpiece with this. You're just trying to convey an idea to yourself to just see if it's going to work. As you're going through and putting this together, don't be afraid to use your brush as texture. Use the side of your brush. Scrub a little bit. There's other techniques that you can use in watercolor painting. For example, you can use salt for texture if you have a damp surface. Now, you don't want this too wet in order for this to work, but if you have a damp surface, you can take some table salt and just sprinkle it on your wet canvas. Well, obviously after you've applied your pigment, of course, your paint. It's damp. Apply some table salt to that, and then just let it dry naturally. Don't use a heat gun, don't use a hairdryer, just let it dry. The salt will absorb some of that extra water, and you'll be left with some beautiful texture. It can put you to mind of ice or snowflakes if you're really close. Different sizes. Sometimes they may be really big if you have large granules of salt, or if you use like the table salt, iodized salt, it may be more fine. And then once it's dry, you just brush it off and you just keep on going, just keep painting. But you get some really nice texture. So use your brush for textures. You can use saran wrap, plastic wrap for texture. You just get it wet. You get you put your paint down, and you can lay some saran wrap on top, and then just lift it. And lifting it up will leave very branchy, foliage-like kind of texture. And all those things are neat. You can use sponges, you can use paper towels. Paper towels are great for clouds. Just put down a blue sky and start dabbing away some of the paint, and you'll be left with some nice, light, fluffy clouds. All kinds of great techniques. Very, very similar to what you would do with oil paint. Well, obviously we wouldn't use salt in oil paint, but we use brushes for texture. And you'll see when we do this, the big painting, how we go. I'm going to use probably a couple different techniques to put in these tree trunks. I'll probably paint some on. I'll probably wipe some away to reveal some. I'll use a fan brush to go in and work on a pine tree. And just by stamping the brush, you'll see that we can create all kinds of texture, implied detail. It's an illusion, the illusion of detail. The detail doesn't really exist. It's just what the viewer believes that they're going to see. So it's not. Don't think. So try not to be intimidated by the different medium. It's just get in there and do it and play with it, and you can create all kinds of crazy things. So obviously I'm working left to right on this paper, and mainly because it is watercolor. So I'm trying not to, if I started from right and go left, I would be putting my hand over it as I go, and I don't want to do that. So I started at the left side of the paper and working my way to the right, back to the front. So the top of the paper, is obviously the furthest point back, and then the bottom of the paper is, or the top of the paper is the furthest point back, and the front of the paper is the closest point to you, the viewer. Scrub them on the canvas to just kind of get some kind of random marks just to give the idea of thin branches and just taking up space. Again, I'm just working on composition and value, and just to kind of build things up and kind of see how it works out. Again, this is just a test. This is just, the planning phase. You can make whatever changes you want to during this. And the closer that you get to the foreground or to the bottom of the camera, or as the objects come closer and closer to you, you want to get darker and darker. So you can see that some of these trees that are going in the foreground are darker than the ones behind them. It's because you're trying to build in layers. So we're using perspective, not in the way that you might think, where you see buildings and you have defined edges that are all pointing to a specific location, so you have vanishing points. We're using the perspective of depth. So, and we do that through various means. You can do that through size of objects. You can do that through value. So the closer things are to you, the darker they are, the further things away, the lighter they get. It just shows depth. You can do that with color. Again, like we had mentioned many times in the past, the further things are away from you, the more they tend to take on the color of the environment. So again, that's an example of using depth as perspective, showing distance. And back to things that you can use for texture, you can use the back of your brush and just scratch things into the wet paint, and you're removing things similar to what we do in oil paint. Sometimes we put our oil paint down, and then we'll just take a paper towel and just remove some of that stuff, or we'll take a brush and we'll just remove some of it to create a highlight. Same kind of thing. Whatever tools you've got. Now, you don't want to scratch the paper, well, unless you do, but yeah, just use what you've got. You can use the back of your brush. You can use an ear swab. You can use cotton swabs. You can use dry brushes. You can use toothpicks. Whatever you want. Whatever you've got. Whatever is going to create the texture that you want. You can use the side of your brush to put things in. Just like what we do when we're oil painting, we put a lot of paint down using the flat of the brush and cover more area. And then if we want to remove paint, we can use the tip of the brush and swipe side to side. You can do that sort of thing just by putting marks down. Obviously, you put more paint down, you use the flat of the brush. If you want to put more thin lines, in this case, I was trying to put more tree trunks in, I just use the side of the brush and I just start like marking it on the canvas. Think about where your shadows are going to go. Explore that. If you put some in and you don't like them, you can always use some water and dilute that wet paint, and then use a paper towel and just dab it up, kind of like erasing it. You can, if it's already dried, you can always try to lift it. You can even add water to dried watercolor paint, reactivate it, and then use a paper towel to dab it up. Now there's a big chance that it will have already stained the paper, so you may not get all of it up, but you can get some, and you can you can massage the paint a little bit to kind of help it loosen up and come up. You can also use a more permanent paint. You can use gesso or white acrylic if you want to completely erase something. Just put it on and let it dry, and then continue to work on top of it. Explore the amount of detail that you want to put in. Again, this is just an exploration of the painting. I would not expect, so when I take this painting and I do an oil painting out of it, I'm not going to try to reproduce this pixel by pixel. I'm not going to try and reproduce an exact copy just in oils. This is simply an idea generator. This is simply to help me get my thoughts in line so that I can put down on my canvas in maybe a little bit more efficient way, a little bit more planning, kind of helps me see the process in which I need to put the paint down on the canvas. And then now at this point, I'm ready to start putting highlights and maybe some snow on trees. So I'm using that opaque watercolor, which is gouache, and you can see how it lies down really, really thick. Now, gouache is a thing where you can dilute it to the point where it will really show the background. So it'll become translucent, not transparent. It'll become translucent. When it dries, it can tend to take on the colors of things that are underneath it. If you put it on thick, very thick, then you can get very bright highlights, and maybe that's what you want, maybe that's not what you want. I try to stay away from flat whites unless I'm working digitally for some reason and I need that white color. But working in traditional paints, I try not to use just straight white. I like to let things mix. And back to the idea of texture, you can get some really cool splatter effects too. In this case, maybe I might be thinking about snow. Is it snowing on this? So I get some really juicy white gouache, which we know is very translucent to the point of being opaque. And you just get it really wet, you put it on your brush, and you just fling it at your canvas. Now you might make a mess outside of the boundaries of your canvas, but what it lands on your canvas, you can get some really, really cool effects. But again, just convey the idea of texture, of highlight, of placement and depth and value all through this study. So here I'm continuing with highlights. I'm putting some snow on things, so I'm working in value. Trying to make sure that some articles stand out on top of other articles, just to make sure that the entire composition reads well. And again, what I mean by reads, I mean the viewer understands what it is that they're supposed to be looking at. And if you can, use a heat source, so whether it be a hair dryer or a heat gun, to dry your layers in between. It's a little bit more difficult to work wet on wet. In watercolor, you can do it. It is possible. It's going to be a much looser painting, so maybe that's what you're going for. But as you start to come forward out of the background, you tend to want things a little bit tighter, because the closer things are to you, the more contrasting they're going to be and the more absolute form they're going to have. The background is fine to work wet and wet. Let things bleed into each other. That's just kind of, that's what part of what's in the whole depth thing, right? You lose contrast, things lose focus, things, and by letting the paint bleed into each other, you're able to get that. Just keep in mind, if I'm gonna have a blurry background, how am I going to translate that into oils? And there's ways of doing it, and we're going to go over that when we get to that video, which will be coming up soon. And then just continue working, rebuilding layers. I put some white gouache down. That's obviously going to dry translucent, so you see some of the dark behind it, just to push the background back. But some of the things I needed to bring forward, so I'm going over it again with a little bit darker paint, just to bring those forward off of that dark background. It's going to add some contrast and allow these things to really describe that depth that we're looking at, and imply a lot of detail that's going on in the background. So I know I sped this painting up as I was working on this. The idea of working through these studies should be quick. The total length of time that I spent on this painting in real time was about an hour. Maybe you want to spend that amount of time, maybe you don't. You don't have to, and that's the whole point. It's just about getting the idea down on canvas in some fashion to determine, is it going to work? And that's the point of this study, just doing a study of what your final piece is going to be. If you're someone who prefers to plan things out, give this a try. I think you'll discover that it takes a lot of pressure off of you, and you won't have to worry so much that you're going to ruin everything if it doesn't turn out just right. I hope you enjoyed the ideas we went over and that you use this information to plan something awesome. You can find inspiration anywhere. Don't be afraid to look. And remember to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and check out my other videos. Smash that notification bell, and I'll see you next time.